All right. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rory Finnin, who is Professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge. He, in fact, established the Cambridge Ukrainian Studies program in 2008. Finnin has curated and organized over 40 exhibitions and cultural events, advancing public understanding of Ukraine's language, history, and society in the UK and beyond. His research focuses on the interplay between culture and identity in Ukraine, with particular attention to Crimea and Crimean Tatar literature. And his broader interests include nationalism studies, solidarity studies, and cultural memory in the region of the Black Sea. Professor Finnin received his PhD in Slavic languages and comparative literature from Columbia University. He is also a returned Peace Corps volunteer, having spent 2 years in Ukraine, maybe even 3 years, in 1995 to 97. Professor Finnin has published extensively, and his book, Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity, which was published by the University of Toronto Press, has received no less than 8 international awards, including the 2024 Laura Shannon Prize in Contemporary European Studies, administered by the University of Notre Dame's Nanovich Institute for European Studies. Professor Finnin has also served as head of the Department of Slavonic Studies and chair of the Cambridge Committee for Russian and East European Studies. We're so delighted that Rory Finnin has agreed to deliver our keynote lecture for the 6th annual Indiana University Taras Shevchenko Ukrainian Studies Conference. And the title of his talk today is Reverse Hallucination, the Case of Crimea. Welcome, Dr. Finnin, and I will turn the microphone over to you.
Sarah, thank you so very much for the warm introduction and for your composure, your calm, your positivity as I played with my laptop in less than constructive ways. По-перше, я хотів би привітати українською
First and
мовою
foremost, I would like
всіх наших
to
колег з
say a few
України
words
і в Україні. І,
Ukrainian to all our
звичайно,
colleagues from
подякувати вам
Ukraine and
усім
in
за
Ukraine,
честь
and of
брати
course to
участь у
thank
цій
all of you
конференції. Дякую вам
for
щиро.
inviting me
Слава
to
Україні!
participate in this conference. It is an honor to me. Thank you and glory to Ukraine. Glory
I
to the
am
heroes.
really deeply honored and very excited to be with you today. I am not sure how this is going to work because if you noticed at the start, I was having some difficulties. So hopefully with Sarah's good help in a moment, I'll have some slides shared, or at least some PDF slides. I had some video, but unfortunately, for whatever reason, technically things weren't working out for me. So I am just so excited. First of all, I am in deep admiration for the IU Ukraine non-residential scholars program, for all of our colleagues at Indiana. I want to thank everyone in the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures, and of course the Ukrainian Studies organization at IU. So Sarah, here we'll try this out. All right, you ready to share the screen? I want to begin first things first and confront this question of what is reverse hallucination and how does it relate to Ukraine's autonomous Republic of Crimea. I first encountered this term many years ago in the work of Akbar Abbas, who is a noted professor of comparative literature at the University of California, Irvine. Abbas used the term to focus on the culture and society of post-colonial Hong Kong, but the term jumped out at me in my study of Ukraine. And you will all understand why. Because, as we know, the field of Ukrainian studies has long been affected by an epistemological problem, a problem of knowledge. Like nature, knowledge should abhor a vacuum. Academic research should gravitate to big, unknown, complex things. But if Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine has made one thing clear, it is that audiences in the United States, in Great Britain, where I am presently, in Europe more generally, So these are audiences we too often reductively refer to as the West. These audiences struggle to place Ukraine accurately on mental maps as a country of persistent strategic and intellectual significance. Until recently, at an institutional level, the Academy largely shrugged its shoulders at the emergence of Ukraine as an independent state in 1991. It tended not to recognize Ukraine as a official object of knowledge, largely due, I would say, to a persistent failure in the academy to disentangle intellectual merit from often old, stale perceptions of political and cultural power. In other words, the problem has been a prevailing logic by which might is not only right, but read. Today's Ukrainian studies initiatives at IU, Notre Dame, and beyond, I think, really combat this resurgent logic. They do it urgently and directly, which is why I would argue they are so important across all academic fields, not only our own. So all of this is why I appreciated the term reverse hallucination, because if hallucination is seeing what is not there, reverse hallucination is not seeing what is there. The concept is more active, it's more trenchant than terms like willful blindness or sanctioned ignorance. So we may look at Ukraine, we may look at Ukraine's autonomous Republic of Crimea, but we don't often see what is there. So you've had a few moments through this PDF screen sharing to look at this image, which is likely familiar, but hopefully also slightly strange to you. It is an image of the Khan's palace or Khan Sarai in Bakhchisarai in south-central Crimea, the seat of political power of the Crimean Tatars for over 3 centuries. So Sarah, would you mind advancing one slide, please? So here's the image as it really is. So we may look at the object, but we often reverse hallucinate. We fail to see what is there. So minarets, Muslim decorative symbols, indigenous culture, historical sovereignty, political homeland. Every conventional so-called postcard image of Crimea is this kind of reverse hallucination. It marks our failure to see beyond the surface, our failure to see much deeper realities of demography, history, and geography that Russia, in particular, has anxiously tried to conceal and erase for a very long time. And one of these things that have been erased and often obscured from our view is the Crimea of the Crimean Tatars themselves, or Krymli, who are, of course, recognized as the indigenous people of Ukraine. Now, despite their centrality to Crimea's past, present, and future, the Crimean Tatars have for too long been sidelined in most traditional Western analyses of Crimean history and society, which has been, as we all know, in the grip of Russian historiographical imperialist agendas. And sadly, until recently, the field of Ukrainian studies has also largely neglected Krimsko-Tataroznavstvo. So, Sarah, would you mind just advancing one slide, please? This is despite the groundbreaking scholarship of Ukrainian polymath Ahat Hanhel Krimsky, who planted a flag, we might say, for the study of Crimea and the Crimean Tatars in Ukrainian scholarship in 1930 with this very seminal collection of historical and cultural essays and primary texts, so Studies Krymu. This neglect of Crimean Tatar studies in Ukraine has, of course, been less intentional than situational. So it has been a symptom of a very long aftermath of Stalinist state violence that suffocated, of course, Ukrainian national culture in various ways in the 20th century and cast Crimean Tatars as so-called unpersons after their forced 1944 deportation. But in 1930, if we go back many decades prior to the deportation, we see here Krimsky arguing that, quote, a complete multi-sided history of Ukraine is impossible, unquote, without a knowledge of the Crimean Tatars, who in his view constituted one side among others. Nearly 70 years later, the Crimean Tatar poet Nuzet Umerov put the matter more poignantly, much more beautifully even. Quote, in thousands of unseen threads, the fate and tragedy of the Crimean Tatar people is bound up in the tragedy and fate of the Ukrainian people. So, as you know, and as I know you've been discussing over the past 3 days of this conference, we often are talking now about the task of decolonization. Decolonization, but our meaning is very contested and often highly abstract and even nebulous. In the case of Crimea and the Crimean Tatars, I think this concept becomes much more tangible and clear. And I would argue that foregrounding the experience of the Crimean Tatars is not only a means of decolonizing our own work about Ukraine and about Europe more generally, it is also a means of starting a journey toward what might be described as Crimea's epistemic deoccupation. That is, the deoccupation of Crimea in the American mind. And since we're obviously grounded here in Indiana University, I want to focus on the importance of this deoccupation of Crimea in the American mind. And really, we should make no mistake. So those of us who are based in the United States in particular, due to the interventions of Ukraine's armed forces, the work of military deoccupation of Crimea has already started. It is already started. We often fail to notice it. As you know, for decades, Crimea and the strategic port of Sevastopol has long been a site of some kind of security for Russia's Black Sea Fleet, but no longer. To date, Kyiv has destroyed roughly half of the tonnage of the Black Sea Fleet and forced a relocation of most of its maritime assets to Novorossiysk, that is, to internationally recognized Russian territory. This is a remarkable development. Ukraine, as we know, doesn't have a conventional navy, but it is nonetheless managed this amazing, and I think remarkable military accomplishment. But it escapes global media attention, which is again often in the sway of establishment groupthink, not only about Ukraine, but also about Russia's so-called military might and so-called red lines. And so, Sarah, I might have to ask you to just forward this to this slide, please. With Donald Trump in the White House, who, as we know, is functioning now as Russia's ally by, among other things, dangling a recognition of Crimea as somehow Russian, we see this military deoccupation of Crimea being downplayed. It's highly contested. And this task, this project that I'm suggesting that we deoccupy Crimea in our minds, feels accordingly perhaps desperate and even quixotic. But I would say that such perspectives are basically intellectual and moral laziness. So if you listen to international relations pundits like John Mearsheimer, for example, Crimea has long been, in his words, quote, lost for good. This is what he wrote in the New York Times in 2014. But academic scholarship should never acquiesce and play along. After the military seizure of territory that violates the UN Charter, that violates the Westphalian model of international legal order, not to mention a host of bilateral treaties, an occupation can be 11 years, it can be 111 years, but it is still an occupation. Euphemism and understatement do not alter that reality. As a professional matter, in fact, we should be concerned by the way in which Crimea, for all its persistent geopolitical and geostrategic significance, appears in our media discourse and in the broader analytical field of view, like Persephone in the underworld. And Sarah, could you please forward to the next slide? Again, I apologize for the conditions of the slides. I think when I exported them to PDF, there was some corruption there, so I apologize for that. But you can see the image, and the image is by Walter Crane of the 19th century. As you recall, Persephone in Greek mythology is the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, who is captured and brought to Hades. At times, she emerges and escapes from Hades and returns to view. And in returning, she affects the transition of seasons. So like Persephone, Crimea at times emerges out of the darkness of Russian occupation to suit a headline, to fill in a particular journalistic narrative, but then it descends back into this darkness again. And like Persephone, Crimea clocks time. It measures time. It determines its rhythms and cadences of Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. As Crimean Tatar activist Nariman Celal, leader of the Crimean Tatar people Mustafa Dzhemilev, and of course President Volodymyr Zelensky have all said, Russia's war against Ukraine began in Crimea and it will end in Crimea. So what I'd like to do today is restore Crimea to a fuller view. That's the first objective. And the second one is to explain the significance of Crimean Tatars to a concept of a future Crimea in a free Ukraine, one that should see them having national territorial autonomy. And we can talk about that in Q&A as well. So, as Zelensky makes clear, Russia's war against Ukraine began in 2014. All of us, of course, understand this and know this all too well. And at this time, in 2014, we begin to see the emergence of this Russian meme, Krym nash, Crimea is ours. The meme is classic imperialist messaging because brash, insistent claims to conquer territory are what empires do to mask anxieties about their own legitimacy. So Krym nash marks the culmination of a long-standing discourse about the imperial possession of Crimea as territory to be taken and held and occupied. This is the predominant trope in Russian culture and society. It is a trope that frames the Black Sea Peninsula as an object of desire and conquest. But for the Crimean Tatars, Crimea is not an object. It is not territory to be held, taken, possessed. For the peninsula's largest indigenous people, so there's of course the Karayim and Krimchak as well, Crimea is part of their collective subjectivity. It is embedded deep into their national identity. So their watchwords are not Crimea is ours, they are Crimea is us. The intimate relation between Crimean Tatars and their homeland gives lie to the claims that, quote, Crimea is perennial Russian land. Krym iskonna ruskaya zemlya, as Putin defensively insists. The mere existence of the Crimean Tatars offers us a view to why Russian and Soviet leaders have sought to neutralize and eradicate the Crimean Tatars through centuries of marginalization, oppression, and ethnic cleansing. The cost has been not only demographic, but also material and cultural. Hundreds of mosques and Crimean Tatar monuments, buildings, and cemeteries destroyed, and thousands of homes stolen and place names changed. So to restore the Crimea of the Crimean Tatars to fuller view, I think literature in particular can offer really rich source material. So today, I would like to focus on a number of literary works, cultural works, by a few Crimean Tatar writers, as well as one prominent Ukrainian writer. These figures are Hussein Shamil Tokhtargadze, Mikhailo Kotyubinsky, and especially Shamil Alyadin, who is responsible for the most important Crimean Tatar novel of the 20th century. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this novel today. It is very significant as a tool to reshape our understandings of the history of the peninsula. All of the literary works that I want to talk to you about today share one thing in common, and that is that they all place Russia in the margins. They provincialize Russia. They disrupt and unsettle Russian colonialist discourses by ignoring them completely. So Russia does not figure in these works at all. These works explore cultural and political possibilities outside the Kremlin's imperialist imaginary, and moreover, on a deeper level, they disrupt colonial time, which David Scott, in his excellent study, Omens of Adversity, likens to linear continuous change that is an endless chain of displacements of before and after. So, Sarah, can we move to the next slide, please? This is Shamil Al-Yadin. He is not only the En Parlak Yildiz, or brightest star of 20th century Crimean Tatar literature, but he's also the Crimean Tatar writer most intertextual with Ukrainian culture. He is himself a very, very tragic figure because in the midst of the Second World War, Al-Yadin stepped down as the chair of the Crimean Writers' Union. He had made quite a name for himself as a figure who translated Shevchenko, in particular Zapovit, into a poem called Vasiyet. And Vasiyet was read at the meeting of the Union of Writers by none other than Pavlo Tachina. So Al-Yadin had connections to prominent Ukrainian figures and worked with them closely. But in the midst of the Second World War, Al-Yadin stepped down as chair, and he returned to military service. He had once served in the Red Army in the 1930s in Starokonstantinov, so in western central Ukraine. He commanded during the Second World War a Red Army platoon. He was wounded twice in combat. So after the Nazi retreat from Crimea, he deserved a joyous homecoming. But what he experienced instead was a nightmare. He returned to Simferopol only to find strangers living in his home. His wife Fatma, his baby daughter Dilara, who was born actually while he was on the front, so he never got to meet her at this time until he eventually finds them both in Uzbekistan. But he came back to Simferopol and discovered that his family had been taken, kidnapped, and brought to Central Asia. This is, of course, an experience of what is called in the Crimean Tatar language surgun, as you may know, the exile, the deportation by Stalin in 1944, which ultimately claimed tens of thousands of lives. I know you are all aware of this event, so I won't go into its detail, but we are seeing, of course, today, after Russia's full-scale invasion of 2022, the same strategies employed. The deportations, the kidnappings, the separations of families, all of these things are returning. And in the West, I think there was a failure to study them as closely and to anticipate how they can return. So for decades, Al-Yadin avoided writing about the nightmare he experienced. And when he was asked in 1971 why he had not used the deportation for material, for a short story or for a novel, he shrugged his shoulders and he asked, "What for? And who will publish it? We are forbidden not only to write, but also to think about the past. Нам запрещено не только писать, но и думать о пережитом." But it took the events of the dissolution of the Soviet Union for Al-Yadin to confront his trauma and to put his memories on paper. Sarah, could we proceed to the next slide, please? His memoir about this period, which is written in Russian, is entitled "Ya vash tsar i bog," I am your czar and your god. And this is a title that comes from an NKVD officer who shouts at him. This is a lower rank as well. So Al-Yadin is a military officer. He confronts this agent of the NKVD. And even though the NKVD officer is of a lower rank, he shouts that he is Al-Yadin's czar and god. There is a terrible sequence of Al-Yadin's epaulets, his aspects of his uniform being removed, people laughing at him, emasculating him, etc. This is a very urgent and gripping read today. It's actually available in Ukrainian translation. It is written in a very economical style with really vivid pacing. Its beginning follows Al-Yadin as he arrives back to Crimea after fighting in the Second World War, when he discovers his hometown emptied of his people and, of course, his own wife and child. And it also features not only these moments of humiliation before Soviet military officials and NKVD officials, it also includes moments in which Ali Din was humiliated by Soviet civilians themselves. So he describes one moment uh, when he knocks on the door of his home, expecting his family to be there. And he finds a Russian family named Frankovsky had seized it and had taken his place. Ali Din, as you might imagine, demanded to be let in. There was a fight at the threshold. And Ali Din remembers that the man that he confronted rubbed his bald head and chuckled and became, quote, amused when he realized that Ali Din was a Crimean Tatar. And this is what he writes. The man at the door understood that in front of him, was a man, albeit in the form, a uniform of an officer, who had no civil rights, whom no law would protect. So this is something that, as Sarah knows better than anyone, is what anthropologists would often call invidious comparison, in which the colonized begins to acknowledge and internalize this asymmetry born of the colonial relation. So Ali Din may be an officer, but he is not a citizen. And so the rest of this work follows Ali Din in desperate search of his family and baby daughter, whom he finds near death in a so-called special settlement camp in Uzbekistan. When Ali Din finds them, reunites with his family, he begins to pick up the pieces of his life and his career, and he embarks on what Frantz Fanon would call an ontological resistance to Soviet displacement and occupation, and he does this through writing and study. I mention all of this because Ali Din is fascinated by one particular literary figure in the Crimean Tatar context. And it, in fact, is a figure who names the street in his hometown. So his hometown in Simferopol had a street named after Hussein Shamil Tokhtargaze. This was a beautiful lane lined with oak trees, and Ali al-Din remembers it very fondly. And it's, I think, this focus on Ali Din's hometown, his home street, and this connection to Tokhtargazi that leads him to write a very influential novel in Crimean Tatar circles that should be read by Ukrainians and scholars of Ukraine today. Sarah, could you proceed to the next slide? Thank you. This is a novel that is originally published in serial form in 1978 in the Tashkent journal Yildiz, which is publishing works at this time in the Crimean Tatar language. Eventually, this novel was published separately in 1979. But in this novel, Ali Din returns the name of Hussein Shamil Tokhtargazi to view for contemporary Soviet and Crimean Tatar readers. The novel is entitled Iblisnin Ziyafetene Davet, or The Devil's Invitation to the Feast, or as you see here, Invitation to the Feast of the Devil. There are different ways to render this title. And this is a novel that showcases a very colorful Black Sea Peninsula. And it focuses and follows the life of Useil Shamin Tokhtargazi, who was an educator, an activist, and a poet of the fin de siècle period. In every one of the stanzas of his poetry was an answer to a question. And the question was, who are the Crimean Tatars? Tokhtargazi was born near Bakhchisarai. Sarah, the next slide would be great here. Tokhtargazi was born here in the village of Kukuz, whose beauty, as you can see, inspired 19th century landscape artists like Carlo Bossoli. Tokhtargazi grew up here in the valley. He lost his father at an early age, so formal education became a really infrequent luxury. While working to provide for his family, he became a very passionate student on his own time. He studied and learned works from both science and humanities. and he began to write poems and songs. But initially, these songs and poems were very rough, very raw. But nonetheless, whatever faults he had initially as a poet, with whatever lack of sophistication that he may have had, his force, his vision was striking. As Ahat Krimsky argued in 1930, Tokhtargazi injected the Crimean Tatar national idea with deep and new creative energy. So he does so by connecting Crimean territory to Tatar culture. And there's an entire discussion we could have about Tokhtargazi's work. What Al-Yadin does in his novel, and Sarah, we can move ahead to the next slide, is follow his life and journey, and in particular, offer us a view of Crimea that is unlike any that we see in works of Soviet or Ukrainian culture in the 20th century. This is a really fascinating novel. It's part detective story, part intellectual romance, part historical ethnography. It's a really fascinating text. What Alidin shows us is a writer in Tokhtargazi who is in between in all ways. So he's a man of simple origins, fated for greatness, who has blistering moral clarity, but he is damned by fame and circumstance and the greed of other Crimean Tatars in his community. So Tokhtargazi is a teacher who plays the violin. He takes his wife's counsel at every turn. And in particular, he works with Crimean Tatar youth all across the peninsula, not only in the mountains, not only in the coasts, but deep into the steppe of the Crimean Peninsula. He cannot look away from the poverty of these children, and he can't hold his tongue when condemning the economic and social circumstances that enable that poverty. So, as other characters remark very succinctly about him, Shamil inat adam, he is a stubborn man. So, Alidin travels, rather, Alidin's figure of Tokhtargazi travels across Crimea. This is, for us today, a Crimea that's almost impossible to imagine. It is a Crimea that has bustling markets, ivy-covered minarets. In this Crimea, you see Tokhtargazi moving through a very diverse, very contested, but ultimately very united and coherent Crimean Tatar society at the twilight of the Russian Empire. A twilight so profound and so dense that Russians do not appear anywhere in the novel, beyond a few brief appearances of scholars from St. Petersburg and Moscow who come to visit various figures in Crimea. So in 1979, 25 years after the Surgun, such a vivid portrayal, such a complex portrayal of a Crimean Tatar Crimea in the Crimean Tatar language, not to mention this focus on a Crimean Tatar historical figure who agitates and works on behalf of his people against all odds. These things made the novel very sensational, potentially very radioactive. And so Alidin does something very strategic and savvy. He uses the trope of the found manuscript to his advantage. So he presents everything in the novel as if it's something he's himself discovered. But in the novel, Crimea is uniquely alive. Alidin presents Crimean Tatar towns like Karavsubazar as diverse and cosmopolitan, and he presents the capital Bakhchisarai as a living, bustling ecosystem with hopes and dreams, with corruption, inspiration. It's many kavehaneler, or coffee houses, and in this novel they are named Yevropa, Velibaba. These are dynamic spaces of debate and social life. And in this passage, for instance, you see Alidin swallowing all of this complex human and cultural material that is evident in Bakhchisarai's 32 different neighborhoods. he swallows it all into one extended sentence. On altı bin adımlık iyalige sahip bu şiirin 32 malisinde. 32 camisi, 32 yüksek acayip minaresi, 32 de imame ve mazani olup, diğer büyük şiirler gibi. İtakdali, itakdali, it's a very, very long sentence. You get the idea, but you can feel the momentum. You can feel the energy in Ali-Din's prose, and you can also sense here how diverse and vibrant this Crimea is. One of the things that Tokhtar Ghazi, the character in Ali-Din's novel, focuses on here is a condemnation, a criticism of religious figures. And you can see a condemnation of religious figures here, the so-called Ruhanileri, so the spiritual men. And so the novel focuses on Tokhtar Ghazi preparing a play that he indeed historically composed in 1909. The play is called Mollalar Projekti, or the Mullahs Project. And this is a work that seeks to condemn clerics for abuses in Crimea. The reason why I want to mention it here is because it just so happens that Ukrainian literature makes so many miracles happen. And one of these miracles involves the figure of Mikhailo Kotyubinsky. So, Sarah, could you please head to the next slide? So many of you may have read a work by Mikhailo Kotyubinsky called Pid Minaretame. Notice the year, 1905. It's well before Tokhtar Ghazi writes his play. I want to talk about Kotyubinsky's work for just a moment, because the genre of historical fiction, as we know, manipulates, it revises and upsets different historical paradigms. It allows us to access different sites of memories. So let's take stock of where we are and when we are, as it were. So Ali-Din, in 1978, writes a novel about a real historical and cultural figure who dies in 1913 after writing this sensational play in 1909, the one that condemns these clerics and spiritual men. The chronological palimpsest gets thicker, though, and even somewhat strange when we place Ali-Din and Tokhtar Ghazi in the context of Ukrainian literature. Because 5 years before Tokhtar Ghazi's play, Kotyubinsky writes a novel about a progressive Crimean Tatar activist who composes a play disparaging and critiquing clerics and suffers brutal violence as a result. So what we have probably not understood about Kotyubinsky's Pid Minaretame is that in many respects it foresees exactly the play that Tokhtar Ghazi writes about a decade later. And it also involves a figure, a protagonist, a hero named Rustem, who is affected by violence at the end of the novel. And that violence is exactly what Tokhtar Ghazi experiences. He's in fact murdered by Crimean Tatar colleagues, knifed in the back. So this is a really strange moment. This connection and synergy between Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar literatures has Kotyubinsky, in fact, foreseeing what will happen in Crimean Tatar culture. And for those of you who haven't read Kotyubinsky's novella, highly recommended work. It was written in Bakhchisarai in 1904, published in the journal Kievskaya Starina in 1905. This is another work that ignores Russians completely. It is a study of profound generational and ideological conflict between two camps in Crimean Tatar society. So the progressive, youthful activists like Tokhtar Ghazi himself, and these conservative, patriarchal clerics who are holding, in Kotyubinsky's story, Crimea and Crimean Tatar society back. We see, I think, in Pid Minaretame, Kotyubinsky at the top of his form, because the novel is alive with the same sights and sounds of Bakhchisarai that we encounter in Crimean Tatar language literature itself. We feel these frenetic rhythms of cafes, the heated debates of its people. And at one point, Kotyubinsky, as you see here, takes us inside a dervish monastery and captures in this really remarkable, vibrant prose. The movements of the young novice Abibullah, who's dancing this whirling dance of the Sema. Плігає тіло в шалених рухах, хвилюють груди, і скаче голова залита потом, а крізь заплющені очі він бачить небо, усе у вогнях, бачить троянди, червоні гранати, білі лілеї, хорять, цвітуть, літають, цілий дощ цвітів. This impressionistic prose is very, very striking and courses through the entire novella. So, like Alyadin in Iblesnin Ziafet and Nedavet, Kotubinsky reveals a Crimea that we just don't know and we don't often see beneath these postcard images that Russian and Soviet historians and scholars and politicians like to pose before Western audiences. And he renders these different sights and sounds of Fantasiakul Crimea through the lens of Crimean Tatars themselves. So again, Russians, Ukrainians, non-Tatar communities, Greeks, they're not featured in Kotubinsky's texts. This is one of the great achievements of Kotubinsky, to decouple the Ukrainian language from representations of Ukrainian life. He opens it up and internationalizes it in remarkable ways, very much like, of course, Lesya Ukrainka and Olya Kubelyanska, who are, of course, his contemporaries. So at the center of this novella is Rustem. And I mentioned Rustem earlier. He's a fascinating character of Kotubinsky's. He's a young son of prominent Muslim clerics in Crimea. He is rebelling against his father. He's rebelling against this conservative community. And he begins to, again, write a play. So this is a trope that courses through Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar culture at this time. I want to show you, if it's okay, Sarah, if we can refer to the next slide. I think you should at least see a screenshot. Because this is a PDF, sadly, I can't show you the video as I had hoped. But that's okay, because the screenshot actually tells you all you need to know. So this is a screenshot from a film called Tatarsky Triptych, directed by Alexander Muratov in 2004. It's a really fascinating film. It is shot entirely in the Crimean Tatar language, but the only versions I've seen have this really intrusive Russian dubbing in it. You can barely hear the Crimean Tatar. It's very, very frustrating. So it's probably good that I didn't show the video anyway. And the importance here is the stage, right? You can see that the stage is itself making a comment about Crimean Tatar culture in the 19th century, foreseeing this independent Ukrainian state that will offer them a home after so many decades of displacement. So I'm bringing up these texts here to show how they intersect and to underscore the really exciting potentials of Krymsko-Tataroznavstvo in the broader field. And these correspondences and intersections are many, and they certainly inspired Alyadin, who actually mentions in the novel Iblesnin Ziafet and Nedavet that Kotubinsky is kind of popping around various cafes. So Kotubinsky is a character in Crimean Tatar language writing. And these cafes are important to the novel. They are sites of exchanges between figures like Tokhtargazi, but also figures like Ismail Bey Gaspirale or Gasprinsky. And Sarah will need the next slide to see him. In the novel, Tokhtargazi engages in a lot of dialogue with Gasprinsky, Gaspirale. He was, of course, as we all know, the legendary educator, civil society leader, and journalist who published the most famous newspaper in the entire Muslim world, Terjuman, Paravoychik, the interpreter. He did so in Bakhchisarai over the course of 3 decades, and he produced over 1,194 issues. Each one of them was his own labor of love. A really, really striking project because it was sweeping in scope and very local in tone. So it tried to be geopolitically ambitious and also intensely personal. Gasprinsky sought to educate and empower Muslim communities, not only in Crimea, but across the Black Sea region. And he did so with a very clear, straightforward language. So this linguistic innovation that is more or less the vernacular of Crimean Tatar that is made penetrable and understandable for other Turkic peoples around the Black Sea. The newspaper is fascinating to explore. You see lots of really interesting complaints from local residents about the quality of the Churuk Suv River in Bakhchisarai. And at the same time, you'll see lots of references to the politics of the Sultan in the Ottoman Empire. It's a really fascinating constellation of different worlds that we see in the newspaper. So we see in Shamil Alidin's novel a lot of exchanges between Gasprinsky as this older generation of Crimean Tatar activists with Tokhtar Ghazi, who represents this young generation. So Alidin presents Gasprinsky here, or Gasparale, as this wise sage who is playing the long game against the Russian Empire. He waits and he repeatedly advocates and preaches waiting. So anti-colonial resistance for Gasprinsky in the novel is about waiting out the occupier, being able to just survive and wait them out. That's the strategy that Gasprinsky keeps employing. By contrast, though, Tokhtar Ghazi is impatient. He wants to wait for no one. He's interested in justice. And in this sense, he's emblematic of a group called the Yash Tatarlar or Genç Tatarlar, the young Tatars. Sarah, could you please advance to the next slide? So the young Tatars rarely published and rarely could publish. Oh, so there's the frontispiece and of the Terjüman newspaper. Gives you a sense of its multilinguality, right? The many different languages presented here. Could you proceed to the next one? Sorry, Sarah. And this is the frontispiece for Vatam Hademe, which was the newspaper for the so-called young Tatars. So these young Tatars that published in Vatam Hademe were trying to condemn Russian colonization more explicitly. They weren't interested in waiting. They didn't have any patience themselves. They wanted to see change in their lifetimes. And they were also more explicit about promoting the idea of a bounded territorial Crimean Tatar homeland. So they presented the politics of, let's say, territorial nationalism. Vatam Hademe was, we might say, Terjüman's stepchild. So it was very vocal, disruptive, and very explicit in denouncing autocracy. One of my favorite moments from this newspaper is this comment, quote, "Czars and sultans offer nothing of value other than the gilded crowns on their heads," unquote. So very direct, very ambitious, politically ambitious language. So this newspaper, because of that language, though, as you can see by reference here to the years 1906 to 1908, sadly, this newspaper only existed for a short period of time. They published only hundreds of issues. It burned very brightly, but burned very fast, ceasing operations in the summer of 1908, as you see here. The reason why I want to show you this newspaper is to underscore and emphasize just how diverse Crimean Tatar society is at the turn of the 20th century. There are many different political groups and parties, and often in our study of Crimea, particularly in the West, we just don't see this, or we think about Crimean Tatars as a monolithic national group. But what these newspapers tell us and what these literary works reveal is a much more differentiated and diverse national collective. And so if we advance to the next slide, and here I'm starting to conclude, Sarah, I want to use these newspapers to show how the events of 1917 were possible. And here we have an image of the first Kurultai, which is a really striking moment for not only the history of the Crimean Tatars, but I would say more broadly for Ukraine and the wider region, because in the wake of the First World War, we see, of course, nearly a dozen non-Russian nations that pursue projects of national self-determination. Many of these projects were short-lived in practice, but in principle, they had a very, very broad and important horizon. And the Kurultai is one of these. So it took its name from the ancient assemblies of the Crimean Khanate that we saw again existing for 3 centuries, from the 15th to the 18th centuries. And in 1917, the Kurultai made a very indelible mark as the most progressive political body in the history of the Muslim world. So when we're talking about reverse hallucination, we need to understand how even in the field of Islamic studies, the Crimean Tatars and the interventions of 1917 are often completely ignored and understudied, and they should be returned to some prominence. I want to show you two people and conclude with them. The leaders of the Kurultai found, first of all, inspiration in Kiev. So in 1917, about a month after Mikhail Hrushevsky's Centralna Rada declares autonomy for Ukraine, a Crimean Tatar delegation visited Kiev, and they were looking to follow in the footsteps of the Centralna Rada. Among the people who went to Kiev was a man named Jafer Sedamet, and Sedamet was extremely interested in understanding how these Ukrainian activists had formed the Centralna Rada. They were interested in what aspirations they had. And Sedamet's memoirs in Turkish are really fascinating because they tell us a lot about key Ukrainian figures like Hrushevsky. So Sedamet goes and meets with Hrushevsky. Sedamet calls Hrushevsky playful-eyed and finds that Hrushevsky is very interested and intrigued with the Crimean Tatar cause. There are even discussions about annexing or joining more formally Crimea to the Centralna Rada. Obviously, it's not yet the Ukrainska Narodna Respublika, but it's on its way. And so Hrushevsky is open to these ideas. Sedamet then goes and visits Volodymyr Vinnychenko. And Vinnychenko is not playful-eyed. According to Sedamet, he's disinterested and, quote, off in his own world. But by far the most enthusiastic, the most supportive figure of the Crimean Tatars in Kiev in 1917 is Petlura. Petlura is incredibly invested in the ideas of the Crimean Tatar political movement. So obviously, the results of these conversations beyond Sedamet's memoirs, they're not entirely clear. As we know, this revolutionary period was highly tumultuous and unstable. What we do know is that in July of 1917, there was a so-called Congress of the Enslaved Peoples of Russia, which was hosted by the Centralna Rada in September. And on this first day, Sedamet paid tribute to the hosts in Kiev and wished, quote, success to the Ukrainian movement. Other compatriots of the Crimean Tatars proclaimed in many different passionate speeches that, quote, just as the Khans formed alliances with Ukrainians in the 17th century, we free sons of the Tatar people extend our hand to you. So this is an untold and often understudied example of Crimean Tatar Ukrainian political solidarity, one that not only took place at a political level, but also was informed by culture. And here at this time, verse was never far from the lips of Crimean Tatar activists. One poem in particular would become a national hymn of the Crimean Tatars, and I'll read that to conclude in just a moment. I do want to point out that the author of this poem is Noman Çelebi-Cihan. You see him highlighted here in the circle on the left. The figure on the right, also circled, is Shafika Gasparale. So Shafika was Ismail's daughter, a remarkable figure, very deserving of our attention in Ukrainian studies, an educator, a journalist, who spearheaded efforts to give women full voting rights and to integrate them into all aspects of public life. So well before suffrage in the United Kingdom. So she was a very ambitious, a very progressive individual, again, very deserving of study. So moments before this particular photo was taken, the assembled Crimean Tatar activists read aloud a poem by Çelebi Cihan, who you see on the left there. The poem is called Ant Etkenmen, and the activists joined in and recited this poem together in Bakhchisarai. This is a really remarkable poem that every Crimean Tatar knows, and it's written in this very confident, compassionate tone. So Çelebi Cihan was the mufti of the Crimean Tatar people, and there is a lot infused from the Quran in his poetry. Sarah, could you proceed to I think it's the last slide here. So this is an excerpt from the poem Ant etken men, söz bergen men millet için ulmege, bilip, kurip milletimnin kız yaşını silmege. Bilmey, kurmey bin yaşasam, kurultayga han bolsam, kene bir gün mezarcelar kelirmene konmege. So as we know, Çelebi Cihan fulfilled this pledge. In the first months of 1918, Bolsheviks forces invaded Crimea. They forced the Kurultai to disband. They arrested Çelebi Cihan. They took him to Sevastopol's Quarantine Bay, where ships were traditionally held before passengers came ashore. They took his clothes and belongings, tortured and shot him, and placed his body in the Black Sea. So this murder would presage what would become an entire epic of violent dispossession at the hands of the Soviet regime. So I want to conclude here with this message that by marking the legacy of the men and women behind the Kurultai, recalling the deeper cultural and historical content of a Crimea of the Crimean Tatars that we see in the works of Shamil Aliyadin, oriented around the figure of Hüseyin Shamil Toktaragaze, as well as, of course, Mikhailo Kotyubinsky. This helps us release Crimea from the grip of Kremlin myths. It helps us release Crimea from the grip of Kremlin obfuscations. It's one step towards deoccupying Crimea in our minds. And it's very urgent today. And that's the note I'd like to end on. Thank you very much.
Rory, thank you for this truly amazing talk. It was just wonderful, so complex and really inspiring at the same time. We have plenty of time, at least 20 minutes for question and answer discussion. So I would like to invite our colleagues to indicate by raising a hand if you can that you'd like to jump in with a comment or a question, and we'll continue with the discussion now. Yes, please, Yulia Kravchenko, please, the floor is yours.
Special pleasure to hear Crimean Tatar language. I very appreciate that you put in your lecture such quotes and read this original text. So thank you very much. And
Thank you,
question, and my question is, it's about how we can empower Crimean Tatar studies all around the world. How we can make more visible this culture, this history, and in that way also attract attention to the Crimean Tatar nation situation, which is so dramatic and so absolutely injustice according to the old history of this nation.
Yulia, thank you so much for such a thoughtful question. And I'd like to also thank Nadia Honcharenko for sending links to various texts that I referred to in this presentation. It's really wonderful. I have seen, as all of you know better than me, I have seen since 2014 an amazing resurgence in Ukrainian efforts to understand Crimean Tatar culture, and for Crimean Tatar activists, particularly those that had to leave Crimea after 2014, for them to share these connections between cultures and histories. It's important that, of course, the darker pages of this history is not forgotten. So, of course, Ukrainians have in cultural memory stories of Crimean Tatars raiding Ukrainian land for slaves in the early modern period. Crimean Tatars have memories of Ukrainians participating in the destruction of the Khanates or in the Surgun itself in the 20th century. So, by highlighting the importance of solidarity in culture, I don't want to turn away from darker pages either. But I have seen so many attempts to overcome what Russian and Soviet and, in fact, Western scholarship has put in the way between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. As we know, the Russian and Soviet authorities employed a very consistent strategy of divide and conquer. And that has gone on for a very long time. But after 2014, writers, activists, musicians have come together to explore these connections. And there are so many of them, and I'm so encouraged by it. One project, as you may know, is Krymsky Injir, Krym Injiri, Crimean fig, which actually, and many of you may know this, but is being translated into English. And so there'll be a kind of emblematic edition in English from the Krymsky Injir collection. There have been a number of different publications over the past few years. This is a compilation of texts in the Ukrainian language and in Crimean Tatar about Crimea, about connections between peoples, an amazing feat, an amazing accomplishment. So we are seeing in terms of publications now more works from Crimean Tatar literature in Ukrainian. And now we're seeing works in both Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar being published into English and other European languages. So that's an amazing step forward in only, 10 years, 10, 11 years. Obviously, the circumstances of those 10 and 11 years are hugely tragic, but it's important to find the positive notes, and this is one of them. From our perspective, and I think, Yulia, your question was about how we in the West in particular can do better. I have been encouraged by attempts to look more closely at Crimean Tatar culture within the bounds of Ukrainian studies. This is a really, really exciting and very difficult area of study, but a very promising one. It's not sufficient yet, so we still need to do more. At Cambridge, we have an initiative in the study of Crimean Tatars. There's an attempt to maybe bring something like that to our colleagues in Oxford. And there's also an attempt in North America, and particularly in Canada, to stimulate more research. The kinds of things that Krymsky did in the 1920s and published in 1930. So I think we're slowly, krok za krokom, we are slowly, making progress. It is, of course, very frustrating to accept how long it's taken, but I think we're getting there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. Do other colleagues have questions, comments, points for discussion you'd like to raise? Yulia, please go ahead.
Thank you for the great lecture. It's shame that even for Ukrainians we know so little about Crimean Tatars. But my question was about epistemologic deoccupation. You mentioned this term, and Ukrainian government a few years ago started this project with cognitive deoccupation of Crimea. I mean, do you feel any influence of it in Western studies? Are there any differences between these two approaches? Thank you.
Yulia, such a great question. You're absolutely right. The institution probably most responsible for pushing this concept of cognitive deoccupation of Crimea has been, as you know, the Crimean Platform, which was started in 2019 by the Zelensky administration. And it has done a lot to bring various diplomats to a table to keep repeating that Crimea is Ukraine. In my experience, in my work with the Crimean Platform, I've been encouraged by the way in which diplomats around the world are not just saying this like some sort of, hostile. It's not a slogan. I think they really understand the importance of Crimea as Ukrainian territory and to remember it and to say it as frequently as possible. But what you're getting at is something much deeper. And this is the challenge. I have slammed, and I know all of us on this Zoom call have had this experience of, hitting our head against the wall to try to explain to people, whether it's in the United States, I've encountered it in Great Britain for 16 years, this failure to look past various myths about Crimea and about Ukraine. But Crimea is an example of a broader, as you say, epistemological problem. What I've seen happen is that in Russian studies and Soviet studies, this concept of somehow Crimea is Russian, it just is repeated over and over and over again. When you ask people, as I do very often when they say such things, what do they mean? What historical material can they offer? When I raise the history of over 3 centuries of political sovereignty, of the Khanate, for instance, the fact that in the middle of the 19th century, 80% of Crimea's population was Crimean Tatar, that it drops precipitously by 1900 because they are ethnically cleansed by the Tsar. These things don't penetrate the Western mind. This is a very loose and general concept. And I'm not sure why. I've looked at this closely, and I think some of it has to do with the Crimean War. So in the 19th century, the Crimean War is the so-called first armchair war. It's the first war that is consumed on a daily basis by European readers in particular, by British readers especially. And so news from the Crimean War is in the newspaper every day. Photographs are being circulated very regularly. And at this time, in the Western mind, this notion of Crimea being Russian sets in there. And it never really leaves, and it's very hard to break it. We see as well how myths like 1954 occupy the attention of people like Elon Musk, who, 2 years ago, I think, was talking about the handover of Crimea from Soviet Russia to Soviet Ukraine as not only a gift, so we all know about that trope, right? Russia imperial language frames any non-Russian nationality or ethnicity as having any connection to territory because it's a gift from Russia. It's a example of generosity from the Tsar or from the party. So not only does he refer to it as the gift, which we've seen so often now for decades, but also as a mistake. And when you ask people what they mean, you see that there are no actual data points, no real understanding of why in 1954 Crimea became a part of Soviet Ukraine. It has everything to do with, of course, the natural connections of the Crimean Peninsula to mainland Ukraine, right? We all know this. We all understand that Crimea is not physically attached to Russia, and that Crimea relies on water supply and so much resource connection with mainland Ukraine. It made sense in 1954 for Crimea to be included into Soviet Ukraine. So I'm not sure how we break through some of these things other than we just have to keep publishing. We have to keep going on to, to television appearances. We have to keep speaking as frequently as we can about details from this history. And I think slowly but surely, we will see that epistemic deoccupation. I think it's happening, obviously not at the pace I would like. And like I mentioned, the reference to Persephone, we keep seeing Crimea disappear from our view when it should be constantly foregrounded. And obviously, we here in Britain, the United States, are responsible for it, but I see it also in Ukraine too, as you all know. Crimea is often forgotten, and we need to keep remembering the significance. If we have this kind of discipline, I think this pace of epistemic deoccupation will increase.
Thanks, Rory. Other comments or questions from anyone? Svetlana, please go ahead.
Дуже дякую, дорогий Рорі. Я хочу
Rory, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a great fan of yours. I would like to thank you for your immense work and impressive efforts to support Ukraine in general and Crimea in particular. In my course on Ukrainian culture, I use your videos on Shevchenko. And if my students remember anything about Shevchenko, that is thanks to you. And I also wanted to mention Nadia Hancharenko, who not only shared materials in the chat box, but she also translated Aladdin's novel, the one that you mentioned today. And Nadia also organized lectures on Crimean Tatars on YouTube. I don't know if you have seen it or not. These are the lectures of Crimean Tatar historians explaining some issues in history of Crimean Tatars. Rory, thank you once again for your endeavors. We are well aware about your work. Your recent paper, your recent article in Slavonic Review, that is a great contribution. Thank you very much. And maybe Nadia wanted to say something.
Пані Світлано, якщо я можу це сказати, я не чув ваше запитання. Ну, я чув ваше запитання, але англійською мовою. Тобто, дякую через те, що я там на цьому каналі. Але
thank you for your question.
я так поважаю роботу Надії,
I
і
heard
щоб
it in the
бути
English
послідовним,
language.
я відповідатиму англійською. Добре?
And if you don't mind, I will stick to English.
Thank you. It's first of all, I want to apologize and thank very, very enthusiastically the interpreters, because I only started realizing in the middle of my presentation just how often dense and complex it was, and I put it together rather suddenly recently. So thanks to all of you who have worked so hard to follow what I was saying, and I hope I wasn't too much of a burden and an annoyance. First of all, Pani Svetlana, thank you so much for bringing Nadia's work into the foreground, because I've been so moved and inspired by what she and so many of her colleagues have done. I am regularly every day inspired by Ukrainian colleagues who have devoted so much attention to Crimean Tatar literature. I think it's something we should all be proud of, and we should celebrate them. So I'm very pleased you raised this. I'm also very grateful for your warm words. And as Sarah is someone I greatly admire, and this whole program is something very special. I think we all feel like we're never doing enough, and we all need to do more. But that the experience of being with each other, even if it's on a Zoom call when I can't share my screen properly and I lose my notes, but it's really special. And so thank you for your kind words, Svetlana. I'm really grateful for them and for all that you do.
Yes, Pani Nadia, please, we'd love to hear from you as well.
I would like to thank you. Well, I cannot keep silent anymore since you mentioned my name so many times by now. I'm very grateful, Rory, for your lecture. Unfortunately, I was a bit late. I was having some technical issues and I couldn't connect from the very beginning. Yes, I was honored to translate Aladdin's novel, I'm Your Tsar and I'm Your God. That is a very deep novel. We have arranged the publication of 5 books of Crimean Tatar prose works, and we are working now on Genghis Danji, who lived in Great Britain, and he didn't have to comply with the requirements of socialist camp. He was this free artist, and I'm happy that his works will be published in Ukrainian. For me, Crimean Tatar literature is part of Ukrainian literature. It is our chance to offer decolonization to Ukrainian culture. We should see this culture not through the prism of Russian historiography, but we need to look at it firsthand. I believe that that is what Rory, you were trying to explain. Thank you very much.
Pani Nadia, thank you. You're absolutely right. That's exactly what I was hoping to get across. And I think also for scholars of Slavic studies, and this is where, of course, the terms in our fields are very problematic. Can we talk about, Crimean Tatar culture within a Slavic department? This is when things get very confusing. But I really want to encourage students who might be at Indiana or around the United States and beyond that these kinds of possibilities are made possible when you study Ukraine. And that's a hugely important message for us to carry to different audiences around the world. That is, Ukrainian studies is not only about learning about Ukraine, it's learning from Ukraine. And the connections of Ukrainians with Crimean Tatars, with Poles, with Jews, these are fascinating connections that led to cultural achievements. And because of our organization of knowledge in universities, we've often, placed these different achievements in silos. I think understanding someone like Cengiz Dağcı, who was born in Crimea, fled Crimea, fought in the Second World War, and as you said, Pani Nadia, he settles in Great Britain. He is one of the most popular writers in Turkish culture. So his works are widely studied in secondary schools in Turkey. There is even a moment in which Dağcı cites a Stalinist writer named Pyotr Pavlenko, who writes a horrific story called Rasviet. It's about Soviet citizens receiving Crimean Tatar homes after the deportation. This is not a work in Russian that is read very frequently, but Dağcı writes about it in Turkish. And so in Turkey today, there are many who, in high school, confront this history of Soviet dispossession that is forgotten about in Russian contexts, but is read by millions of children today. So Dağcı absolutely should be better known in Ukraine. And of course, Ukrainian culture should be better known in Turkey. And that's another reason why supporting Crimean Tatar culture, Kırımlı culture, is important for the relationships we have in the Black Sea. And when we write about and study these connections, we find that they have deep human use in this terrible moment we find ourselves in during this war of aggression. And so I hope we can encourage more of this kind of work. And it just takes, I think, Viednost is sila, right? We have to work together across these continents, which is why I think the program at IU and this program which has done so much, and people like Sarah are so special, and we need to celebrate them, and try to produce more among our own students in the years to come.
Thank you, Rory, for your kind words. Stas, please go ahead. I will mention that our interpreters are going to need to leave right on the hour. So a big round of applause for Yana and Anastasia. Thank you so much for your amazing work. Once they leave, we will all just be in one channel and we'll manage however we manage. So sorry, Stas, go ahead with your comment, question, whatever.
Pomowna atmosfera.
Tak. Oh,
Класно. Як, as you like, Stas.
давай, Стас.
Я тоді прийду.
Радий бачити. І питання в мене таке: провокаційна дуже назва, візуальна. Але приклади здебільшого пов'язані з літературою. Я розумію, що розмежування там мови Коцюбинської, яка дуже візуальна, від візуальної культури, ну так, воно не дуже сильно, дуже чітка лінія. Але в мене питання, що, наприклад, нам візуальна культура, іконографія кримсько-татарська.
All culture, visual arts in Crimean culture. What does it contribute to Ukrainian culture, Soviet culture? And how can it counter those hegemonic narratives that exist in the visual culture currently? So since you started talking about visual culture in your metaphor, I would like you to elaborate on this topic. Thank you so much.
Дякую, Stasa. Thank you very much. Right. Well, lots to say about visual culture. Of course, I think immediately about connections that Lesya Ukrainka made as a young visitor to Crimea. She would write to her uncle Drahamanov about embroidery designs that she saw in Crimean Tatar visual culture, material culture, and how they reminded her so much of Ukrainian designs. So this visual is very important to foreground. I think the example I, of course, have written about thanks to you, actually, and colleagues at the Dovzhenko Center that made this text available to me, is to call attention to a film, 1926, directed by Georgi Tassin, called Alim. This is a striking film because it exists as an example of what I call cross-Korenizatsiya. What I mean is this is a work that was produced under the conditions of Korenizatsiya, Ukrainizatsiya, produced by Vuvku, but it took its story from Crimean Tatar folklore about this kind of Crimean Tatar Robin Hood figure named Ali Aydamak. And so it takes the Crimean Tatar folklore, channels it through the Ukrainian film industry, and is read and interpreted and received by Crimean Tatar audiences as their first, перша кримсько-татарська картина, I think it is, перший кримсько-татарський film. I can't remember exactly which one, but they receive it in this way as Crimean Tatar. So it's produced by Ukrainian industry, and you can see how this example of a film like this is promoting strength within the context of Vuvku's emergence and evolution, and at the same time amplifying and giving voice to Crimean Tatar folk stories and Crimean Tatar history. So that exchange takes place in visual culture. It is a work that only has limited distribution, but thanks to the Dovzhenko Center in particular, and to works and achievements from someone named Stas Menzalevsky, these kinds of films are distributed and circulated further. These are the kinds of works that I think need to be promoted going forward. It's difficult to say, and I caught part of your question in the English language translation here about the Soviet visual legacy. But the one thing I would say about Alim is the deep, rich ethnographic detail. So you're absolutely right that Kotyubinsky is such a visual writer. What makes him special is his attention to the visual and his way of rendering it in this really economical style. And that's what we see with Alim. There is such great attention to Crimean Tatar markets, even to aspects of Crimean Tatar economy. So these various leather producing businesses in Bakhchisarai, for instance, which Gasparinski writes about as polluting the waters of Crimea. This is called attention to in Tassin's film Alim. So there's a lot of attention here, and we can see certainly how a film like Nariman Aliyev's Evge or Dodomu is also reflecting on the way Crimea teaches us about displacement, about the horrors of occupation, about the lives of people who must persist in occupation. So I think in films, there is a lot being done, not to mention those that are directed and filmed by Setablayev, like Khaytarma, about the Crimean Tatar pilot Ahmet Khan Sultan. So there, I think, and that Muratov film, which I know you've seen, the Tatarsky Triptych, is another case of Ukrainian filmmakers promoting the Crimean Tatar language and developing a kind of synergy that in the arts I think is just understudied generally. So I did focus on literature. That's kind of where I'm most comfortable, but in visual culture, there's a lot of material to draw upon. So if I understood fully your question, I will say it wasn't provocative, but very thoughtful, and of course, extremely sophisticated.
Rory, thank you so much for this amazing keynote speech. It's been really inspiring. I mean, the breadth of your expertise, the depth of your knowledge is really just something for all of us to emulate. I appreciate your kind words about me and the program, but I have to acknowledge my wonderful colleague, Svetlana Melnik, who is very much an equal partner in everything that we do through the Non-Residential Scholars Program for Ukraine. So Svetlana, thank you for your solidarity, for your expertise, and all of your wonderful energy that you bring to the program. We're going to have to leave it here, my friends. It's hard to say goodbye after spending the last 3 days with all of you. It's been a really wonderful conference. Thank you all for your engagement, for your participation, for spreading the word about the Taras Shevchenko Ukrainian Studies Conference. We will be in touch soon with lots of follow-ups. As you know, we are hoping to produce a publication based on the conference, so we will be in touch with details. And again, Rory Finnin, the perfect way for us to end our conference with your inspiring talk. I learned so much from you, and I'm looking forward to following up on some of the resources that you shared. Nadia Hancharenko, thank you so much for your efforts, your expertise, and just wonderful to see everyone. So до побачення and слава Україні!
Героям слава! Дякую вам усім!